The more you try to fix yourself, the worse you feel. Pause for a second. Let that land. Because if you're being honest, you've probably felt this too. We live in a strange time. A time where people have never understood themselves more, and yet have never felt more anxious, more fragmented, more exhausted by their own minds. You know the routine. You journal every feeling. You analyze every reaction. You label every emotion. Was that my inner child? Is this a trauma response? Am I anxious, attached, or avoidant today? Shadow work, therapy language, healing frameworks, self-awareness stacked on top of more self-awareness. At some point, everything becomes about you. And here's the uncomfortable question no one in the self-help world likes to ask. Why does knowing yourself better often make you feel worse? This is the paradox. Self-help didn't fail you. It just went too far. Somewhere along the way, growth turned into self-surveillance. Healing turned into constant monitoring. And awareness quietly became obsession. Alan Watts once described the ego as a magnifying glass. The ego is a magnifying glass. The more you stare at it, the bigger the problem feels. And that's exactly what's happening. You're not broken. You're not regressing. You're not failing at healing. You're just staring too closely at something that was never meant to be examined endlessly. In this video, we're going to explore why excessive self-observation collapses the mind instead of freeing it. Why modern self-help accidentally feeds the very anxiety it promises to heal. And why peace doesn't arrive through endless self-understanding, but through something far more counterintuitive. A lighter approach, a more natural one. One that doesn't require fixing yourself at all. So stay with me, because what if happiness doesn't come from understanding yourself better, but from forgetting yourself more often? At some point, growth stops being growth and starts becoming self-surveillance. There's a subtle line most people don't notice when they cross it. On one side of that line is healthy awareness. On the other side is something far more exhausting. Healthy awareness is simple. You notice your emotions, you listen to your body, you reflect, learn, and then you live. But obsessive self-monitoring never lets you leave. Every thought gets inspected. Every feeling needs a label. Every reaction becomes a case study. You don't just feel anxious anymore. You analyze the anxiety. You question its origin. You judge yourself for having it. Was that a trauma response? Is this my inner child acting out? Am I anxious attached right now, or avoidant? Notice what's happening here. Your mind is no longer a place you visit. It's a control room you never clock out of. Slowly, without realizing it, your inner life turns into a project. One with endless updates, endless bugs, and no final version. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The ego loves this, because as long as there's something wrong with you, the ego has a job, a problem to solve, an identity to maintain, a story to keep running. Alan Watts warned about this decades ago. He said the mistake of modern man is treating the self like a machine, something to tweak, optimize, and repair. But you're not a machine. You're a living process. A river doesn't need to understand itself to flow. A tree doesn't analyze its roots before it grows. Life moves naturally until the mind steps in and demands supervision. When growth becomes surveillance, spontaneity dies. You stop responding to life. You start monitoring yourself responding to life. And that's when freedom quietly disappears. Because the more self-conscious you become, the harder it is to act. The harder it is to speak. The harder it is to feel anything without second-guessing it. This is why so many people feel stuck after years of self-work. This is why so many people feel stuck after years of self-work. Not because they haven't done enough, but because they've done it without ever letting go. Here's the small but crucial lesson of this stage. Understanding yourself does not automatically liberate you. Sometimes it just tightens the spotlight. Awareness is meant to be a doorway, not a prison. And when the spotlight never turns off, the mind starts to fold in on itself. Which brings us to the next layer of the trap. Because once the mind starts watching itself non-stop, it doesn't just get tired, it begins to consume itself. And that's where overthinking truly begins. Overthinking is not intelligence. It's anxiety pretending to be insight. At first it feels productive, like you're being careful, thoughtful, deep. But overthinking isn't depth, it's recursion. A thought appears, then a thought about that thought, then a thought about why you're thinking that thought, then anxiety about the fact that you can't stop thinking. It's a fractal. The same pattern repeating at smaller and smaller levels until clarity dissolves into noise. Imagine pointing a camera at its own screen. What do you get? Not a clearer image, just distortion, flicker, feedback. That's exactly what happens when the mind turns fully inward. The tool meant to interpret life starts interpreting itself, and life quietly disappears in the background. Think about the moments you felt most alive. Playing a sport, driving on an empty road, lost in conversation, creating something with your hands, falling in love. In those moments, you weren't thinking, how am I doing right now? You weren't monitoring your emotions. You weren't narrating the experience. You were simply in it. And the second self-awareness rushes back in, the second you start watching yourself perform, something tightens. The flow breaks. This is where modern self-help makes a crucial mistake. It teaches that every feeling must be analyzed, every discomfort must be understood, every inner movement must be translated into meaning. But some experiences aren't problems to solve. They're processes to pass through. Alan Watts used a simple analogy. He said the mind is like a knife. It's excellent for cutting, for dividing, for making distinctions. But try to make a knife cut itself, and you don't get precision. You get damage. The mind was never designed to endlessly dissect its own movements. When it tries, it doesn't become wiser. It becomes anxious. Because insight has a rhythm. It arrives when there's enough space, enough quiet, enough non-interference. Peace doesn't live at the level of more understanding. It lives at the level where understanding is no longer forced, where the mind relaxes its grip and lets experience unfold without commentary. This doesn't mean you stop thinking. It means you stop interrupting life with thought. And here's the small but essential lesson of this layer. Not every emotion needs your attention. Some only need your permission to move on. When you stop intervening, the mind begins to settle on its own. But there's a deeper reason why letting go feels so difficult. Because beneath all this thinking, there's an identity that depends on staying busy. An ego that survives by keeping you focused inward. And that's what we need to look at next. The ego doesn't want you healed. It wants you busy. This is where the story takes an uncomfortable turn. Most people assume the ego hates self-improvement, that it resists growth, that it fears awareness. But that's not quite true. The ego doesn't hate self-help at all. In fact, it thrives on it. As long as self-help keeps circling one familiar question, what's wrong with me? As long as your attention stays locked inward, the ego stays alive, because the ego is built out of separation. It survives by constantly reminding you that you are a someone standing apart from the rest of life. Continuous self-focus reinforces that boundary. Every time you monitor your thoughts, every time you narrate your emotions, every time you ask whether you're healed enough, aware enough, evolved enough, you strengthen the sense of a central me that needs managing. From a psychological perspective, this creates a closed loop. The observer and the observed become the same thing. And the more you observe yourself, the more solid and heavy that self feels. That's why self-focus often shrinks your world instead of expanding it. Compare this with a child at play. A child building a sandcastle isn't thinking about confidence. They're not checking their emotional state. They're not wondering if they're doing it right. They're absorbed. And in that absorption, they're happy. Now compare that with many adults on a path of self-improvement. They meditate, but evaluate the meditation. They journal, but judge what they write. They rest, but feel guilty for not optimizing. They're never fully anywhere, because they're always watching themselves be there. Alan Watts saw this clearly. He once said, trying to get rid of the ego is the ego's favorite game. Why? Because the moment you declare war on the ego, you create a new identity, the one who is trying to transcend the ego. And the ego quietly slips into the driver's seat again. This is why so many people feel trapped in endless inner work. They're not failing at healing. They're feeding the very structure they're trying to escape. Here's the crucial reframe. You don't suffer because you're not good enough. You suffer because your attention is locked too tightly on yourself. You're not missing some final insight. You're standing too close to the picture. And when you're too close, all you see are pixels. The question isn't how to destroy the ego. It's how to stop giving it constant fuel. And that brings us to a possibility most people overlook, because the way out isn't more effort. It's a different relationship with attention itself, a way of loosening the grip without forcing anything at all. And that's where forgetting yourself becomes not a flaw, but a doorway. Peace doesn't come from understanding yourself endlessly. It comes from forgetting yourself occasionally. That sentence can sound dangerous in a culture obsessed with self-awareness. So let's be clear about what it does not mean. Forgetting yourself is not avoidance. It's not suppression. It's not running from your feelings or numbing your pain. Forgetting yourself is absorption. It's the moment attention moves so fully into experience that the commentary in your head goes quiet on its own. Think about an artist painting late into the night. Hours pass. It feels like minutes. There's no analysis of mood, no checking of progress, no internal narration, just movement, color, presence. Or think about hiking up a mountain, your breath syncing with your steps, your awareness widening instead of folding inward, the body engaged, the mind silent, not because it's forced to be, but because it's no longer needed. Cooking a meal slowly, walking through a forest without headphones, even washing dishes when you're not trying to be mindful. These moments share something essential. There is no central me watching them happen. From a psychological standpoint, this state has a name: flow. These moments share something essential. There is no central me watching them happen. From a psychological standpoint, this state has a name: flow. Flow states are marked by reduced self-referential thinking, less mental narration, less self-evaluation, less identity maintenance. The brain shifts from monitoring the self to engaging with the task. And interestingly, this is when people report the deepest satisfaction. Not insight, not breakthroughs, not emotional analysis. Just quiet fulfillment. This is where modern self-help often points in the wrong direction. It tells you to turn inward, to observe more, to track every inner movement. But nearly every ancient tradition points the other way. Zen doesn't ask, "Who am I?" It asks you to sit until the question dissolves. Taoism doesn't encourage self-improvement. It encourages alignment with what's already happening. And Alan Watts reminded us again and again that the self is not a thing you can find, only an activity you can stop clinging to. When you lose yourself, you don't disappear. What disappears is the constant sense of separation, the tension of having to be someone at all times. Here's the simple but radical lesson of this stage. You don't need more insight. You need more moments where insight steps aside. Moments where life is allowed to live itself through you, without commentary, correction, or control. And once you taste that kind of peace, even briefly, you start to notice something else. It isn't effort that brings it. It's a shift in how attention is held. Which means the final step isn't about doing more, but about relating differently to experience altogether. And that's where integration truly begins. You don't outgrow suffering by fixing yourself. You outgrow it by no longer making yourself the center. This is the point where everything we've explored begins to come together. Not as a new technique, not as another framework, but as a shift in orientation. Carl Jung never meant individuation to become obsession. It was never about staring endlessly at the psyche. It was about becoming whole enough to turn back toward life. And Alan Watts went even further. He reminded us that the self is a useful idea, like a name or a map, helpful for navigation, but disastrous when mistaken for reality. The problem isn't that you have a self. The problem is when the self becomes the center of every experience. Integration begins when attention loosens, not by force, not by discipline, but by a quiet rebalancing. Here are 3 subtle signs you're moving in the right direction. First, you ask fewer personal questions. Life happens, and instead of immediately asking, "What does this say about me?" you let it happen. Second, the inner narrator softens. You tell fewer stories about who you are, what this means, and where it's all going. Moments no longer need constant translation. Third, you start to appreciate silence, not as a practice, but as a natural state. There are stretches of time where nothing needs to be fixed, understood, or improved. And surprisingly, those moments don't feel empty. They feel spacious. This isn't spiritual bypassing, it's maturity. To support this shift, you don't need complex rituals, just a few simple, non-heroic practices. Set aside 10 minutes a day to do something with no intention to improve yourself. Walk without a podcast. Listen to music without analyzing the lyrics. Wash dishes without calling it mindfulness. Not to become calmer, not to be present, just to let attention rest outside the story of me. Over time, something gentle happens. The observer grows tired. The constant self-referencing loosens, and life begins to feel lighter, not because it's perfect, but because it's no longer being examined under a microscope. Here's the final lesson of integration. Happiness is not a permanent state you achieve. It's what remains when the effort to manage yourself relaxes, when the magnifying glass is set down, when the river is allowed to flow. And from here, the question is no longer, how do I fix myself? It becomes something much simpler. What happens when I stop getting in the way? And that's the space we'll step into next. The more you try to fix yourself, the worse you feel. Now you can hear that sentence differently. Not as a failure, not as a warning, but as an invitation to step out of a habit that quietly exhausted you. You don't need another inner map. You don't need a more detailed explanation of who you are, why you are this way, or what still needs healing. At some point, the map stops helping, and the only way forward is to step outside of it. Self-help isn't wrong. Awareness isn't the enemy. Understanding yourself has its place, but when understanding becomes endless, life waits patiently in the background. So maybe the next step isn't more introspection, maybe it's participation. Stop asking who you are and start living what you already are. A moving process, a moment unfolding, a presence that doesn't need commentary to exist. Think back on the moments that felt truly alive, the ones that stayed with you. Chances are, you weren't thinking about yourself at all. You were absorbed, engaged, gone in the best possible way. So here's the question I'll leave you with. Not to answer right now, but to notice over time. What if the happiest moments of your life were the ones where you weren't thinking about yourself at all? If this resonated, share your experience in the comments. When was the last time you forgot yourself, even for a few minutes? And if you'd like to keep exploring ideas like this, ideas that don't promise to make you better, but simply help you see a little clearer, consider subscribing. Not for self-improvement, not for optimization, just for perspective. Because sometimes the deepest peace arrives not when you finally figure yourself out, but when you gently stop trying.